one black cleaner, one racist CEO, and a grand piano worth more than her yearly salary. What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her turned into a moment that changed both their lives forever. But the real story? It's about how music can break down the strongest walls of prejudice, even in the coldest of hearts. But let's start at the beginning. It was a cold Thursday evening in Boston, the kind where the wind whips between skyscrapers like an angry ghost, and most office workers had already rushed home to their warm apartments. The Sterling Technologies building stood tall against the darkening sky, its 50 floors of glass and steel reflecting the city lights like a giant mirror. Inside, on the highest floor, something unusual was about to happen. Something that wasn't supposed to happen. Something that would make headlines in the morning papers and spread across social media like wildfire. Sarah Jenkins wasn't meant to be there that night. At 28, she'd spent 3 years cleaning the lower floors of Sterling Technologies, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. The pay wasn't great, but it helped with her mother's medical bills, and that's what mattered. The 50th floor was different. Everything screamed money, from the marble floors that sparkled like diamonds to the artwork that probably cost more than Sarah's yearly salary. The air even smelled expensive, like leather and success. But it was the grand piano that caught her eye. It sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, its white surface glowing in the city lights like something from a dream. A Steinway and Sons, the Ferrari of pianos. Sarah knew this because her grandmother had taught her everything about pianos, back when dreams seemed possible and the world felt kinder. The cleaning cart squeaked slightly as Sarah pushed it past the piano, trying to ignore how her fingers itched to touch those keys. 3 years of cleaning offices had taught her one important rule: don't touch what isn't yours, especially not when you're the only black cleaning lady in a building full of white executives. The clock on the wall showed 8:30 p.m., when everything changed. The elevator dinged and Sarah's heart stopped. Nobody was supposed to be here this late. Nobody except the cleaning staff. But the man who stepped out wasn't just anybody. Marcus Sterling III, CEO of Sterling Technologies, and known throughout Boston for two things: his brilliant business mind and his particular views about people of color in positions of power. Sarah quickly turned away, praying to become invisible. She'd heard stories about Sterling from other cleaning staff, none of them good. Some said he'd fired people for looking him in the eye. Others whispered about racial slurs muttered under his breath. What happened in the next hour would test everything Sarah believed about herself. It would challenge Sterling's deepest prejudices, and it would remind everyone that sometimes the greatest talents hide in the most unexpected places. But right now, standing in that gleaming office with her cleaning cart and her secrets, Sarah had no idea she was about to become part of something much bigger than herself. Growing up in Roxbury, Boston's historically black neighborhood, Sarah Jenkins learned two things early: life isn't fair, and dreams cost money. Her small apartment above Martinez's grocery store wasn't much, but it was home. She shared it with her mother, Linda, who'd worked as a nurse until multiple sclerosis forced her to stop 3 years ago. Their living room held their most precious possession, an old, upright piano that Sarah's grandmother, Mama Rose, had bought from a church sale back in 1985. The piano was scratched and some keys stuck, but to Sarah, it was pure magic. Mama Rose wasn't just any grandmother. In the 1960s, she'd played jazz in some of Chicago's hottest clubs. "Music isn't about being perfect, baby girl," she'd say, her fingers dancing across the keys. "It's about telling your story. And everyone's got a story worth telling." Every afternoon after school, while other kids played outside, Sarah sat beside Mama Rose at that piano. They started with classical pieces: Bach, Beethoven, Mozart. But as Sarah grew, Mama Rose introduced her to jazz, blues, and soul. By age 12, Sarah could play Ray Charles's "Georgia on My Mind" well enough to make grown men cry. "You've got magic in those fingers," Mama Rose would say proudly. "Don't you ever let anyone tell you different." Sarah won every school talent show. Her teachers talked about music scholarships, about Berklee College of Music, right there in Boston. The future seemed bright, full of possibilities. Then life happened. Mama Rose passed away suddenly when Sarah was 17. The funeral costs ate up their savings. Then came her mother's diagnosis. Medical bills piled up like autumn leaves. College dreams disappeared faster than morning dew. Sarah took the cleaning job at Sterling Technologies 3 years ago. The pay wasn't great, but they offered health insurance, a blessing when your mother needs expensive medications. She still played piano at church on Sundays and sometimes at the Blue Room, a small jazz club in Jamaica Plain. But those moments felt like glimpses into another life, one that could have been. Most nights, after her shift ended at 9 p.m., Sarah would take 2 buses home. She'd help her mother into bed, then sit at their old piano, playing softly with the mute pedal down. In those quiet moments, she'd remember Mama Rose's words about everyone having a story. Her coworkers at Sterling Technologies didn't know about her music. Why would they? To them, she was just another cleaning lady, invisible in her gray uniform. Even Maria, who usually cleaned the executive floor, only knew Sarah as the quiet one who never complained about extra shifts. That Thursday evening, as Sarah pushed her cleaning cart through the executive floor, she thought about how different her life might have been. The grand piano by the window probably cost more than she'd make in 10 years. Its pristine white surface reflected the city lights like it was made of stars. Sarah glanced at her watch, 8:25 p.m. Just a few more offices to clean, then home to Mom. They were running low on her medication again. Maybe the Blue Room would have an opening this weekend. They usually paid cash for performances. She didn't know it yet, but in 5 minutes, everything would change. Marcus Sterling III would step out of that elevator, and Sarah's 2 worlds, the one where she cleaned offices and the one where she made music, would collide in a way nobody could have predicted. But right now, she was just doing her job, trying to stay invisible, trying to keep her dreams locked safely away where they couldn't hurt anymore. Because that's what you do when you're a cleaning lady in a building full of millionaires. You keep your head down and your stories to yourself. If only Mama Rose could see her now, standing next to a $500,000 piano she wasn't allowed to touch. What would she say about dreams deferred and talents hidden? The elevator dinged, and Sarah's world was about to turn upside down. Marcus Sterling III stepped out of the elevator like he owned the place, which technically he did. His Italian leather shoes made soft clicking sounds against the marble floor, each step worth more than Sarah's weekly paycheck. At 45, he looked exactly like the magazines described him. Tall, silver-streaked hair, and a face that had never known what it meant to struggle. But it was his eyes that made Sarah's skin crawl. Cold. Calculating. Like a predator sizing up its prey. "What are you doing here?" His voice cut through the silence, sharp as broken glass. Sarah's heart drummed against her ribs. She gripped her cleaning cart tighter, knuckles turning white. "Filling in for Maria, sir. She's sick tonight." Sterling moved closer, each step deliberate. The air around him smelled of expensive cologne and privilege. "And who?" He paused for effect. "Authorized this change?" "Mr. Rodriguez, sir. The cleaning supervisor." Sarah kept her eyes down, remembering what her mother always said, "Sometimes staying small keeps you safe." But Marcus Sterling III wasn't interested in keeping anyone safe. He circled her slowly, like a shark testing the water. "Interesting," he said, though nothing about his tone suggested interest. "Tell me, what do you think of that piano?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Before Sarah could answer, voices echoed from the elevator lobby. Sterling's face lit up with what could only be described as cruel anticipation. "Perfect timing," he said, checking his Rolex. "The board members are arriving for an emergency meeting." Sarah's stomach dropped. Something about his smile made her want to run. "Sir, I should finish my work and—" "Oh, but you must stay," Sterling cut in, his voice dripping with false warmth. In fact, he glanced at the piano, then back at her, eyes glinting with malice. "I insist you provide us with some entertainment while we wait for everyone to arrive." The elevator dinged again. "Unless," Sterling added, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "you'd prefer I discuss your unauthorized presence here with Mr. Rodriguez? I hear jobs are hard to come by these days, especially with your background." Sarah felt the threat wrap around her throat like a noose. Her mother's medication cost $2,000 a month. They needed this job's insurance. But as board members began filing into the room, their curious eyes landing on her gray uniform, Sarah realized this was never about authorization or entertainment. This was about power, about putting someone in their place, about a man who thought he could break people just because he could. What Sterling didn't know, what none of them knew, was that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the power. Sometimes it's the one with nothing left to lose. And Sarah Jenkins, standing there in her cleaning uniform, was about to show them exactly what that meant. The board members filed in like royalty entering their court. 7 of them, each carrying the weight of their wealth like invisible crowns. Victoria Blackwood, with her perfectly styled silver hair and pearls worth a small fortune. James Chen, the youngest board member, known for challenging Sterling's old money views. Richard Montgomery III, whose family had been in Boston longer than some of its buildings. Marcus, Victoria's voice dripped honey-coated poison. "What's this? Unusual entertainment you've arranged?" Sterling's smile widened. "Our cleaning staff has kindly volunteered to demonstrate her musical abilities." The way he said cleaning staff made it sound like something stuck to his shoe. Sarah stood frozen, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too scratchy, too visible. The board members formed a loose semicircle, some leaning against expensive desks, others settling into leather chairs. Their faces showed varying degrees of amusement and discomfort. "Well?" Sterling gestured toward the piano. "We're waiting." Sarah's feet felt like lead as she walked toward the Steinway. Each step echoed in the silent room. Behind her, someone whispered something that made others chuckle. Her cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The piano bench was cool leather, probably worth more than her car. As she sat down, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished white surface. She saw what they saw, a cleaning lady in a gray uniform, way out of her place. But then she saw something else. In the piano's reflection, she saw Mama Rose's face, heard her voice. "They can take your job, baby girl, but they can't take what's inside you. That's yours forever." "I don't have all night," Sterling's voice cut through her thoughts. "Though I suppose if you're not capable, what would you like to hear?" Sarah's voice surprised even her, steady, clear, unafraid. Sterling blinked, thrown off script. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The cleaning lady was supposed to fumble, embarrass herself, know her place. "I'm sorry?" he managed. "Classical? Jazz? Contemporary?" Sarah's fingers rested on the keys, familiar friends ready for battle. "This is a Steinway Model D, sir. It can handle anything." The room went quiet. Even Victoria Blackwood's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose slightly. Sterling's face darkened. This wasn't the entertainment he'd planned. "You seem to know a lot about pianos for a cleaning lady." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied simply. "I do." James Chen leaned forward in his chair, suddenly interested. Richard Montgomery stopped checking his phone. Something in the air shifted, like the moment before a storm breaks. Sarah looked at the keys, black and white living in perfect harmony. Mama Rose used to say music was the great equalizer. It didn't care about the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. It was time to prove her right. Sarah took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. What happened next would change everything. Sarah's fingers touched the keys softly at first, like testing water. The opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata floated through the room, gentle as falling snow. Sterling's smirk widened. He'd expected something simple, predictable. But Sarah was just warming up. Halfway through the first movement, she did something unexpected. Her left hand kept Beethoven's haunting melody, while her right hand began weaving in notes from an old jazz standard her grandmother loved. The combination was startling, classical precision dancing with soulful improvisation. Victoria Blackwood's teacup froze halfway to her lips. Richard Montgomery's phone slipped from his fingers onto the plush carpet. James Chen sat forward, his eyes widening. Then Sarah really began to play. Her fingers flew across the keys, building layers of sound that seemed impossible for 2 hands to create. The music swelled, filling every corner of the room with a story. Her story. The struggle of late-night bus rides home, the weight of her mother's medical bills, the memory of Mama Rose's hands guiding hers across worn piano keys. The board members sat transfixed. Gone were their condescending smiles, replaced by genuine awe. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to lean in, listening. Sterling stood rigid, his face a battlefield of emotions. The weapon he'd tried to use against Sarah had transformed into her shield, her sword, her victory. As she played, Sarah remembered every slight, every dismissive glance, every time someone had judged her by her uniform instead of her heart. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about truth, about showing everyone, that talent doesn't care about tax brackets or titles. The music built to a crescendo, her fingers dancing across the keys like they were made of lightning. Classical techniques merged with jazz rhythms, soul harmonies wrapped around blues progressions. It was as if every genre, every style, every form of musical expression had come together in perfect harmony. James Chen's eyes glistened with tears. Victoria Blackwood's perfectly manicured hand pressed against her chest. Even Richard Montgomery, known for falling asleep in board meetings, sat spellbound. But it was Sterling's face that told the real story. Gone was the arrogant smirk, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of having his worldview shattered, fear of the power of raw, undeniable talent. Sarah's hands moved faster, building to the finale. The piano, this magnificent instrument worth more than she'd make in a decade, sang under her touch like it had been waiting for her all along. Each note was perfect, each chord a declaration. I belong here. The final sequence was a masterpiece of technical skill and emotional depth. Sarah poured everything into it, her dreams, her struggles, her grandmother's legacy. The last chord rang out, powerful and pure, hanging in the air like suspended starlight. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. For 5 heartbeats, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The city lights twinkled silently beyond the windows, witnesses to something extraordinary. Sarah's hands rested in her lap, her heart pounding. She didn't look at them, didn't need to. The silence said everything. Then, from somewhere behind her, a single person began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the entire floor. Sarah finally turned around. James Chen was on his feet, clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Victoria Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with an expensive handkerchief. Richard Montgomery had dropped all pretense of indifference and was smiling broadly. And Sterling? He stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The man who'd tried to humiliate her now couldn't even meet her eyes. Extraordinary, James Chen's voice cut through the applause. Absolutely extraordinary. But before anyone could say more, before Sterling could recover his composure, Sarah stood up. Without a word, she walked back to her cleaning cart, her steps steady, her head high. The room watched her in stunned silence. She'd just delivered the performance of a lifetime, and now she was going back to work like nothing had happened. Because that's what professionals do. And Sarah Jenkins, whether cleaning floors or playing piano, was nothing if not professional. But everyone in that room knew. Nothing would ever be the same again. Wait! James Chen's voice cut through the stunned silence. He moved quickly across the room, pulling a business card from his wallet. Miss Jenkins, Sarah replied quietly. Sarah Jenkins. Miss Jenkins, I'm not just a board member here. Chen's eyes sparkled with genuine excitement. I also serve on the board of the Boston Symphony Orchestra and run the Chen Foundation for Arts Education. Sterling shifted uncomfortably, watching his carefully orchestrated humiliation transform into something entirely different. James, surely this isn't the time. Actually, Marcus, Chen cut him off sharply, this is exactly the time. He turned back to Sarah. Where did you study? Sarah's hands tightened on her cleaning cart. I didn't, sir. My grandmother taught me. She played jazz in Chicago during the 60s. Victoria Blackwood, who moments ago had been smirking at Sarah's uniform, now stepped forward. Your grandmother was a jazz musician? In Chicago? During the 60s? Her tone had changed completely. Was she part of the South Side scene? Yes, ma'am. Rose Jenkins. She played at the Blue Note and... Rose Jenkins? Victoria's perfectly maintained composure cracked. The Rose Jenkins? I have her records. She was legendary in the jazz world. The room's energy shifted again. Now everyone was looking at Sarah differently. Not as a cleaning lady who could play piano, but as Rose Jenkins' granddaughter, heir to a musical legacy. Sterling watched his power in the room evaporate. He opened his mouth to speak, but Richard Montgomery beat him to it. I remember those records, Montgomery said, his usual bored expression gone. My father used to play them in his study. Said Rose Jenkins could make a piano tell stories better than most people could with words. James Chen seized the moment. Miss Jenkins, we have a community outreach program at the Symphony. We're always looking for talented musicians to teach masterclasses, perform in our community concerts, and mentor young artists. He handed her his card. Would you be interested? Sarah held the card like it might disappear. I have responsibilities. My mother's medical bills. The position comes with full benefits, Chen said firmly, and a salary significantly better than, he glanced at Sterling, your current arrangement. Sterling's face had turned an interesting shade of red. This wasn't just a talented cleaning lady anymore. This was Rose Jenkins' granddaughter, someone with musical heritage, someone he'd tried to humiliate for his own amusement, and everyone in the room knew it. Call my office tomorrow, Chen continued. We'll set up a proper audition, though after what we just heard, he smiled warmly, it's really just a formality. Sarah nodded, carefully tucking the card into her uniform pocket. Her hands were steady now, her back straight. She'd walked into this room as a cleaning lady they wanted to mock. She would walk out as something else entirely. But the night wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The board members began filing out, each stopping to shake Sarah's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable an hour ago. Victoria Blackwood even asked if Sarah would sign her grandmother's vinyl records. When you have the time, of course. Soon only Sterling remained, standing by his massive desk, his authority stripped away by something as simple as music. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with unspoken words. Sir, Sarah said quietly, reaching for her cleaning card. I should finish my work. Stop. Sterling's voice was different now, softer, almost uncertain. He walked to the window, staring out at the Boston skyline. Why didn't you ever say anything? About your abilities? About your grandmother? Sarah straightened, meeting his reflection in the glass. Would it have mattered, Mr. Sterling? Would knowing about my grandmother have changed how you see people like me? Sterling flinched. The truth in her words hit harder than any accusation. I watched you, he said suddenly. Every night this week, through the security cameras. I saw you looking at this piano, never touching it, just looking. He turned to face her. Why didn't you ever play it? Because, Sarah replied simply, I know my place. The words hung between them like a mirror, reflecting back everything wrong with his assumptions, his prejudices, his world. And what exactly, Sterling's voice cracked slightly, is your place, Miss Jenkins? Sarah stood taller, channeling every ounce of dignity her grandmother had taught her. My place, Mr. Sterling, is wherever my talent takes me, just like your place is wherever your abilities take you. The only difference is you never had to prove yours quite so publicly. Sterling moved to the piano, running his fingers along its pristine surface. My mother played, he said quietly. Not like you, but she loved it. After she died, I kept this piano as decoration. Nobody's touched it in years. He laughed bitterly. Until tonight. Sarah watched him carefully, seeing something shift in his expression. I owe you an apology, he said finally. What I tried to do tonight, it was cruel and small and completely beneath both of us. Yes, Sarah agreed. It was. Sterling nodded, accepting her directness. I can't change what happened, but I can try to make it right. He reached for his phone. Let me call Rodriguez, arrange a transfer for you to our cultural department. Better salary, benefits. No. Sarah's voice was firm but gentle. Thank you. But no. Sterling looked startled. But surely. Mr. Sterling, Sarah interrupted, sometimes the best apology isn't trying to fix things, it's learning from them. She turned to her cart, ready to finish her shift with the same dignity she'd shown all evening. Miss Jenkins? Sterling called after her. Would you play something else? Just one more piece? Sarah paused, considering. Sometimes she realized transformation starts with a simple request, and sometimes forgiveness sounds like music. By morning, the story had spread through Sterling Technologies like wildfire. The cleaning lady who played like an angel, the CEO who got schooled in talent and prejudice. The night music changed everything. Sarah arrived for her regular shift the next day to find her coworkers looking at her differently. Maria hugged her tight, whispering, "Why didn't you tell us, girl?" Even Mr. Rodriguez stood straighter when she passed, as if uncertain whether to treat her as an employee or a celebrity. But the biggest changes weren't in how others saw her. They were in how Sarah saw herself. She called James Chen's office that morning, her hands shaking as she dialed. His secretary put her through immediately. "Sarah," Chen's voice boomed through the phone. "I was hoping you'd call. Can you come in today? The symphony's artistic director is eager to meet you." 3 hours later, Sarah sat in a plush office at Symphony Hall, her cleaning uniform replaced by the best clothes she owned. The artistic director, Dr. Eleanor Wright, listened intently as Sarah played on their practice piano. "Your technique is unconventional," Dr. Wright said when Sarah finished. "But there's something special here, something raw and real. We need that in our community program." The salary they offered made Sarah's head spin. Full medical benefits that would cover her mother's treatment, flexible hours, and most importantly, a chance to teach young musicians who, like her, had talent but lacked opportunities. "There's one condition," Chen added, smiling. "We want you to give a proper concert here at Symphony Hall. Tell your story, your grandmother's story, through music." Sarah thought about Mama Rose, about all those nights practicing on their old upright piano. When? Next month, we'll call it From Service to Symphony, an evening with Sarah Jenkins. Back at Sterling Technologies, Sarah worked her final 2 weeks with the same dedication she'd always shown. But now, when she passed the grand piano on the 50th floor, she didn't look away. Sometimes, during her breaks, she'd play. Word spread and employees would gather quietly to listen. Even Sterling would emerge from his office, standing in the background, watching transformation happen in real time. On her last day, Sterling called her into his office. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about learning rather than fixing." He handed her an envelope. "We're establishing a music scholarship for underprivileged youth. The board approved it unanimously this morning. We'd like you to be on the selection committee." Sarah opened the envelope. The scholarship was named after her grandmother, the Rose Jenkins Memorial Music Fund. "Will you help us?" Sterling asked. "Help us find more hidden talent? Help us do better?" Sarah looked at the man who'd tried to humiliate her just weeks ago. His eyes were different now, humbler, more human. "Yes," she said simply, "I will." Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving people wrong, it's in helping them become right. 1 month later, Symphony Hall buzzed with anticipation. Every seat was filled. Sterling Technologies employees, board members, music lovers, and most importantly, dozens of cleaning staff in their gray uniforms invited as VIP guests. Sarah stood backstage, wearing a midnight blue gown that sparkled like starlight. Through the curtain, she could see her mother in the front row, sitting in her wheelchair, beaming with pride. Next to her sat James Chen, Victoria Blackwood, and yes, Marcus Sterling III himself. But what made Sarah's heart skip was the group of young kids from Roxbury, sitting wide-eyed in the center rows. Children who, like her, had dreams bigger than their circumstances. They were here on special invitation, the first beneficiaries of the Rose Jenkins Memorial Music Fund. As Sarah walked onto the stage, the spotlight caught something small pinned to her dress, her cleaning service badge, a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd come. The audience fell silent as she sat at the grand piano, but before she played, Sarah stood and approached the microphone. "Tonight isn't just about music," she said softly. It's about seeing people. Really seeing them. It's about looking past uniforms and titles to find the magic underneath." She paused, looking directly at the children from Roxbury, and sometimes it's about being brave enough to show your magic to the world. What happened next would be talked about in Boston's music circles for years to come. Sarah played like her life was a symphony, each piece telling part of her story. Classical merged with jazz, soul danced with blues, and somewhere in between, something entirely new was born. But this isn't where our story ends, because while Sarah played that night, something else was happening across town. In a small jazz club in Jamaica Plain, another cleaning lady was humming as she mopped the floors, hiding her own talents behind a uniform. In a downtown office building, a security guard was writing poetry between his rounds. In countless places across the city, people were holding their dreams close, waiting for their moment to shine. Sarah Jenkins' story wasn't just about one night of amazing music. It was about what happened next. The doors that opened, the lives that changed, the talents that emerged from unexpected places. But that's another story. One that's still being written, one note at a time. Want to know what happened to those kids from Roxbury? Curious about how Sterling Technologies changed after that night? Wondering if Sarah's music reached beyond Boston? Subscribe to hear these stories and more. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations happen after the applause fades and the real work begins. Remember, talent doesn't care what you wear, where you come from, or what others think of you. It only cares about one thing. Are you brave enough to let it shine? Are you?